On the last Saturday in June, the village of Little Brackley woke to an air of innocent festivity. The Women's Garden Society held its annual 50 in the grounds of Orchard House, and such an event meant bunting flapping gaily, sponge cakes trembling on trestle tables, and a murmurous excitement that made even the vicar's usually dignified stride acquire a faintly jaunty swing. Orchard House itself stood slightly apart from the main village street, reached by a narrow lane bordered with hawthorn. It was a handsome, rather square Georgian house with a wide, shallow staircase and a garden that, according to those who liked such things, went down wonderfully. It was owned by Mrs. Lavinia Carstairs, still handsome, still imperious, who had settled there 4 years previously after the sudden death of her husband. "Money," said Mrs. Dolly Bantry with relish, as she adjusted a vase of sweet peas on the refreshment table. "Money and temper. But she does the thing properly, you must admit." Miss Jane Marple, who sat placidly behind a plate of jam tarts contributed by herself, merely observed the scene with mild blue eyes. She was spending a fortnight with her old friend Dolly, and had been roped in, quite as a matter of course, to help just a little with the fee. Helping, in this case, meant cutting slices of seed cake and listening to the undercurrent of village opinion that hums as steadily as bees in clover. There was plenty to listen to that morning. Mrs. Carstairs, in pale lavender linen, moved about the lawn like a small but determined battleship, issuing directions. Her niece, Alice Brent, dark, thin, and nervy, helped with a quick, restless competence. Dr. Leonard Fielding, the village doctor, chatted with the vicar by the croquet hoops. Captain Hugh Denning, retired from the army and recently from India, stumped along on his stick, surveying everything with a jaundiced eye. They say he quarrelled dreadfully with Mrs. Carstairs about that hedge, murmured Mrs. Bantry to Miss Marple. Boundary lines and all that. Men are so odd about their bits of land. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, thoughtfully. From the lane beyond the yew hedge came the sound of a motor car, drawing up with a sharp crunch of gravel. Heads turned, as they always do in a village. Out stepped Inspector Francis Harrow from Milchester, unexpectedly smart in a dark suit, followed by a man in town clothes whom nobody recognized at first glance. "Police," breathed someone. "Whatever next?" But the inspector, after a word with Mrs. Carstairs, merely strolled, outwardly casual, towards the house. His companion, a neat pale man with rimless spectacles, disappeared through the side entrance. The small excitement subsided, but an agreeable sense of having something to talk about later was left behind. It was just after 3 o'clock, when the judging of roses was at its most controversial, that the first sharp note of discord truly sounded. Alice Brent, her hands stained faintly green from handling foliage, was seen hurrying towards the house, her face strained. "I'll only be a moment. Aunt Lavinia," she called over her shoulder. "I forgot." The wind snatched away the rest. She did not. 10 minutes passed, then 15. A little whispering began. Mrs. Carstairs, tightening her lips, sent the maid, Elsie, to look for her. Elsie scurried in by the French doors and did not come out. It was Miss Marple, later, who noticed how the hum of conversation faltered, then broke altogether as Inspector Harrow reappeared at the top of the wide stone steps. His face had altered. The pleasantness had gone out of it, leaving something grave and official. "I'm afraid," he said, and his voice carried quite clearly over the bright sunlit lawn, "I must ask everyone to remain here for the moment. There has been an accident inside the house." And at that precise instant, though no one knew it yet, the peaceful order of Little Brackley was overthrown by death. For a suspended moment, no one moved. The tea tent, So recently a hum of conversation and the clink of cups seemed frozen around Miss Marple like a tableau. Then sound and motion returned all at once. Chairs scraped, a cup fell and smashed. Someone gave a little hysterical laugh that turned halfway into a sob. Mrs. Bantry recovered first. "An accident?" she repeated sharply. "Where, Dorothy? What happened?" Dorothy Crane seemed to struggle for breath. "In the study. Mrs. Carstairs' study. It's Gerald. Mr. Gerald Carstairs. I think he's dead." There was a stir like the wind moving across the tops of trees. Two of the village men, Major Elwood and young Dr. Peter Latham, were already striding toward the house. Miss Marple rose more slowly, setting her knitting neatly upon the chair. She did not hurry. There was very little advantage, she had once observed, in being first to look at a dead body. People, on the other hand, were quite different when observed in the first confusion of shock. As the guests began to drift toward the house in a disorganized cluster, Miss Marple found herself beside Venetia Carstairs. The older woman's face had lost all color, yet her bearing remained remarkably composed. "Gerald?" Venetia said, as if the name were unfamiliar. There must be some mistake. He went in scarcely 10 minutes ago. "Accidents," murmured Miss Marple, "have a distressing habit of occurring at the most inconvenient moments." Venetia gave her a brief, bewildered look and then moved forward, the crowd parting instinctively to let her pass. Miss Marple, by no effort of her own, seemed somehow to follow in her wake. The study lay just off the central hall, accessible from both the green and black doors, a fact that had often been remarked upon, though rarely considered important. Now it suddenly felt significant. The green door, from which the scream had issued, stood wide open. The black door behind them, through which Dorothy had emerged, had already been firmly closed. In the study, Dr. Latham knelt beside the prone figure on the carpet. Gerald Carstairs lay on his back near the writing desk, one arm flung out, his face turned slightly to the side. A decanter of whiskey on the desk sat untouched, the glass beside it half filled. The smell of something sharp and metallic hung faintly in the air. "He's dead," Dr. Latham said at last, rising. "Quite dead, and it's no accident." Venetia made a strangled sound, her hand flying to her throat. "How dare you? How can you say such a thing? You've not even—" "Forgive me, Mrs. Carstairs," the young doctor interrupted, his tone gentler, "but there is a wound at the back of his head. Blunt force, I should say. Someone struck him hard. It would have been instantaneous. The word murder was not spoken, but it hung there all the same, a heavy, uninvited presence in the tasteful, book-lined room." Miss Marple did not approach the body. Instead, she studied the surroundings. The window stood slightly open, letting in the faint buzz of 50 music and the sweet smell of crushed grass. On the writing desk lay an open chequebook, a fountain pen without its cap, and a sheet of notepaper on which Gerald had written, in a bold, untidy hand, "You leave me no choice." The rest of the sentence had been blotted by an irregular splash, as if a hand, perhaps an unsteady one, had dragged across the page. "Best everyone clear out of here," Major Elwood declared sturdily. "Police must be called at once. Nobody touch anything." "Nobody has touched anything," Dorothy Crane whispered. She stood pressed against the doorframe, her eyes wide and almost glassy. "He was like that when I came in. I only wanted. Mrs. Carstairs had asked me for the accounts book." Miss Marple glanced swiftly at her, the tight clasped hands, the slight rocking motion, the repeated emphasis. "I only wanted. I only, not uncommon." she reflected, in people who had had a real shock, and very useful sometimes in people who wished to appear so. "Of course we must call the police," Venetia said suddenly. Her voice, though strained, had recovered a measure of authority. "Major Elwood, would you be so kind as to telephone Inspector Graves in Brackenhurst? Peter, will you stay with Gerald until they come?" "Naturally," replied the doctor. Miss Marple slipped quietly from the study with the retreating group. In the hall, voices had already begun their characteristic transformation. Lower, urgent, tinged with a certain dreadful excitement. "There is," she thought with mild sadness, "very little that so enlivens a village as a good murder." By the time they reached the lawn again, speculation had already begun its swift flowering. "Quarrel over money, I shouldn't wonder," Mrs. Price Edwards confided in an undertone to Mrs. Bantry. "Everyone knows Gerald was forever asking his stepmother for funds. My cousin in Surrey," remarked another lady with relish, "had the most dreadful business in her family over a will. It split them entirely. I dare say there is a will here. There generally is. These modern young men," said the vicar's wife, shaking her head, "are altogether too wild. Drink, cards, petrol, there is no stability." She lowered her voice. "Suicide, perhaps?" But the doctor said, "Someone began." Miss Marple listened, her expression one of gentle abstraction. She had already observed three things which did not, to her mind, quite agree with accident, suicide, or even that convenient catch-all. A quarrel gone too far. None of them, individually, would have seemed important. Together, they formed the faintest outline of something yet to be understood. She wondered what Inspector Graves would make of a house with 2 front doors, a dead stepson in the study, and a village that already thought it knew the answers. People, after all, were very often wrong. Inspector Craddock began the weary task of shepherding villagers from the library back into the garden, where the 5th tables now resembled the aftermath of a storm. Abandoned cups, wilting sandwiches, petals scattered by hurried footsteps. He commandeered a small writing table for his notebook and summoned the principal witnesses in turn. Miss Marple, apparently absorbed with recounting her stitches, sat near enough to hear without seeming to listen. It was astonishing, she often reflected, how invisible old age rendered one at precisely the moments when invisibility was most useful. "Miss Crane," Craddock said, his tone gentler than it might have been with a less obviously fragile woman, "I'd like you to repeat, as clearly as you can, exactly what happened." Dorothy Crane twisted the corner of her handkerchief. I realized we were running low on napkins," she began. "So I went into the house, through the black door. The linen cupboard is just along that corridor. As I passed the library, I noticed the door was open. I looked in and saw her." "Was anyone else in the corridor?" Craddock asked. No one at all. I called out, but no one answered. Then I ran to the other door, the green one, and shouted for help. I must have screamed," she added faintly. "I barely remember." Miss Marple's needles paused again, almost imperceptibly. "Ran to the other door. That would account for the scream seeming to come from that side. Yet something in the sequence felt oddly rehearsed, like a line in a play spoken one beat too late." Inspector Craddock nodded. "Thank you, Miss Crane. Please remain available." He next called Gerald Carstairs, who arrived with a certain swagger that grief had not entirely banished. "My stepmother and I spoke briefly by the rose garden," he admitted, before Craddock could even frame the question. "We had a family matter to discuss. It became heated, I suppose. But she was quite alive when I left her. I came into the house shortly afterwards to telephone my solicitor." "Through which door?" Craddock's pencil poised. The black door. Naturally. The study telephone is nearer that way. Gerald lifted his chin with an air of defiance. I heard nothing, no scream, no disturbance, until Miss Crane shouted. Miss Marple, watching, noted the faint sheen of perspiration at his temple, the way his eyes slid for a fraction of a second toward Dorothy before returning to the inspector. Not the reaction of a man entirely unconcerned. The murmur of gossip among the onlookers grew steadier as more people surrendered their versions of events. Mrs. Price Ridley maintained in scandalized tones that Venetia had been far too free with her money. The Reverend Clement mentioned, with reluctant candor, that Mrs. Carstairs had recently spoken of putting her affairs in order, and Mrs. Bantry, who knew far more of village undercurrents than she cared to admit, leaned toward Miss Marple. "Everyone seems dreadfully certain Gerald is involved," she whispered. "That quarrel, and his debts. Why, half the village has lent him money at one time or another." Miss Marple nodded absently. Human beings, she had often observed, liked their explanations simple and their villains obvious. It saved so much troublesome effort. Yet, she said mildly, one must remember that money is only one form of motive, and not always the most powerful. Her gaze drifted toward the house, toward the twin doors now guarded by constables, and the blank windows that concealed whatever private dramas had played out within. A companion whose alibi depended upon her own account. A stepson with public cause for resentment. A dead woman noted for her generosity, and perhaps for her power over others. Somewhere among these very ordinary motives, Miss Marple felt sure, lay something rather less ordinary. The house with two doors had been designed, long ago, to accommodate a family division. It occurred to her that, in human affairs, physical arrangements were rarely accidental. Someone, she thought, had chosen very carefully which door to use, and when. When at last Inspector Craddock released the bulk of the garden party to return to their homes, on the strict understanding that they were to remain available, there was a faint but perceptible sense of disappointment among them. Death, Miss Marple reflected, had always possessed a morbid fascination, particularly when it occurred so conveniently close to one's own front gate. She allowed herself to be shepherded away by Mrs. Bantry, who was fairly quivering with the need to talk. The two ladies found a quiet corner of the terrace overlooking the lawn, now littered with abandoned paper plates and wilting bunting. "Gerald is obviously the one," Mrs. Bantry burst out. "Everyone heard that dreadful quarrel. You'll regret this, Venetia," he said. "You can't get much more incriminating than that." Miss Marple, tucking her knitting away into her capacious reticule, shook her head gently. "Angry people, my dear, say all sorts of foolish things. One should be wary of believing too readily in what appears on the surface. A pond that looks muddy is often merely shallow." Mrs. Bantry looked at her sharply. "You don't think he did it?" "I think," said Miss Marple mildly, "that if he did, it would be remarkably convenient for everyone concerned. And I have lived long enough to be suspicious of anything that relieves a general anxiety too neatly." They were joined a moment later by Inspector Craddock himself, who approached with a look of harassed purpose. "Miss Marple," he began, "I wonder if I might, have the benefit of your impressions? Purely unofficially, of course." "Naturally," Miss Marple said. "I was only remarking to Mrs. Bantry how difficult it is to be certain of people's movements in a house with more than one entrance." Craddock nodded, seating himself rather heavily on the stone balustrade. "That's just the trouble. 2 doors, 2 stories. Gerald swears he went out the black door and straight to the spinney. Miss Crane says she came in the same way a little later. Neither admits to seeing the other. Yet the west vestibule is quite confined, is it not?" Miss Marple asked. "I seem to remember a very pretty umbrella stand, which makes the space narrower still." "You recall correctly," Craddock said, eyeing her with reluctant admiration. If both accounts are true, they must have passed within inches of each other without noticing. Which is possible, I suppose, but not very likely. People can be remarkably unobservant, Miss Marple said. Still, when two people give stories which fit together a shade too comfortably, I am reminded of a curate I once knew who always volunteered his alibi before anyone had asked for it. It turned out in his case that the missing communion plate was simply mislaid, but the principle remains. Craddock gave a faint smile. You believe they're shielding each other? Oh, I never believe anything, Inspector. I merely notice that certain possibilities exist. Tell me, has anyone mentioned Mrs. Carstairs' will? He started slightly. As a matter of fact, yes. Gerald raised the subject almost at once. Too soon, if you ask me. Claimed Venetia had recently changed it to his disadvantage. Miss Crane seemed rather alarmed when he said so. Quite natural, Miss Marple said. Companions and housekeepers are often extremely vulnerable when a change of household occurs. A new mistress or master may prefer their own staff. Craddock closed his notebook with an air of finality. You don't make my life easier, Miss Marple. I came here expecting a straightforward domestic crime, and already you've got me thinking about curates and communion plates. Life, Inspector, Miss Marple said gently, is very seldom straightforward when money and pride are involved. As he returned to the house, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the two front doors, standing in gloomy contrast, the green door slightly ajar. The black now guarded by a constable. A curious house, divided yet united, offering alternative entrances to the same interior. Much like the stories people told about themselves, she reflected. There was usually more than one way in, and often it was the less used door that revealed the truth. Inside, she knew, the body of Venetia Carstairs still lay in the library, the bronze bookend with its tragic and comic masks mute witness to a very private drama abruptly concluded. Yet the true performance, Miss Marple suspected, was only just beginning. Inspector Craddock, though visibly intrigued by Miss Marple's quiet observation, maintained his professional reserve. For the moment, he said briskly, "We shall keep an open mind." Both Mr. Carstairs and Miss Crane had opportunity and, it would seem, possible motive. Until we learn more about Mrs. Carstairs' affairs, any definite conclusion would be premature. He requested that most of the villagers return to their homes, taking careful note of names and addresses. The fefty was formally declared at an end, though the story of the afternoon would, Miss Marple knew, be discussed at kitchen tables and in cottage parlors for weeks to come. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry were among the last to depart the manor. As they stepped out into the cooling evening air, Miss Marple paused for a moment on the gravel sweep, her gaze resting thoughtfully on the two front doors, their glossy paintwork gleaming in the fading light. "You know," she remarked mildly, "it does so often come down to doors, whether metaphorical or quite literal. The ways people choose to enter and leave situations can be most illuminating." Mrs. Bantry gave her a sharp look. "You think one of them is lying?" "My dear, I think almost everyone is lying," Miss Marple replied calmly. "The question is, about what and why?" They walked slowly down the drive, past beds of carefully tended herbaceous borders now casting long shadows. Behind them, the manor loomed, and from an upper window a curtain moved almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple's quick eyes caught the motion. Someone was watching the departure of each guest with great interest. That evening in St. Mary Mead, over a light supper, Mrs. Bantry could contain herself no longer. "Well, Jane, you must have formed some opinion. Gerald? Or Dorothy? You can't possibly think of anyone else?" Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea. "Opinions formed too early, my dear Dolly, are rather like souffles taken from the oven before they are set. They have a tendency to collapse. But the evidence, his argument with Venetia, his lies about the door, that dreadful handkerchief. All very striking, Miss Marple agreed placidly. Striking things usually are. They draw attention, sometimes quite deliberately. Yet what interested me more was something very small and quite unremarked. She took a delicate sip of tea. You recall Dorothy's shoes? Mrs. Bantry blinked. Shoes? Really, Jane. A young woman in modest circumstances does not change from stout, practical shoes into unsuitable pumps in the midst of a crisis without reason, Miss Marple said gently. And I noticed no mud or grass stains on either pair, though she claims to have moved between the gardens and the house repeatedly. One does not cross gravel and lawn without leaving some trace. No, Dolly. Something about Miss Crane's account does not quite ring true. Mrs. Bantry stared at her. Then you believe she killed Venetia? I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that Miss Crane is hiding something. Whether that something is murder remains to be seen. Gerald, too, is being less than candid. His lie about the green door is particularly fascinating. People rarely lie about direction unless direction itself is important. The following morning brought rain, and, with it, a certain dampening of excitement in Little Brackenhurst. Yet at the village shop, the talk was of nothing but Ashwood Manor. Half an hour later, Miss Marple, returning from her own modest marketing, found Inspector Craddock waiting in the vicarage sitting-room, where the Reverend Clement had invited her to give, as he put it, such assistance as her experience may warrant. Craddock rose as she entered. Miss Marple, I have had the opportunity to examine Mrs. Carstairs' private papers. They introduce a rather new element into the business. It seems our dear departed lady had been making inquiries not only into Miss Crane's past, but also into the circumstances of her own husband's death. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Ah, she said softly. The late Mr. Carstairs. I had wondered when he would step onto the stage. The color drained so completely from Gerald's face that for a moment Miss Marple thought he might faint. He gripped the back of a chair, the knuckles standing out sharp and white. That's absurd, he managed. My inheritance was settled years ago. My father's will was perfectly clear. Inspector Craddock regarded him over the open diary. According to Mrs. Carstairs' notes, she had certain doubts as to the accuracy of statements made at the time of probate. She mentions consulting Mr. Latimer, your father's solicitor, and speaks of irregularities that cannot be allowed to stand. Gerald licked dry lips. Latimer is a doddering old fool. Venetia was easily influenced. No doubt she misunderstood some legal phrase or other. Miss Marple, who had known several solicitors of remarkable clarity well into their 80s, thought this a rather hasty dismissal. Her eyes drifted to Dorothy Crane. The companion sat rigid, but there was a flicker, barely perceptible, of something like dawning calculation behind the fear. Information shifted value rapidly when connected to money. Craddock continued, his tone even. An entry from 2 days ago. If matters are as suggested, Gerald's claim may be entirely unfounded. Must confront him after 50, no longer possible to postpone. There was a murmur in the room. Mrs. Price Ridley, scenting scandal, leaned forward like a hound on the trace. Then Mrs. Carstairs intended to disinherit him? Miss Marple quietly corrected her. Not disinherit, my dear. If the claim were unfounded, he would never have been entitled in the first place. There is a difference, though I dare say not one that would feel less painful to Mr. Gerald. Gerald rounded on her with sudden violence. You talk as if I were some sort of impostor, Miss Marple. I am my father's only son. Biologically, Miss Marple said mildly, matters are sometimes less straightforward than people like to suppose. Though I am not suggesting anything in particular, you understand. I merely observe that Mrs. Carstairs appears to have developed serious doubts. Inspector Craddock closed the diary with a soft but decisive snap. Until we speak to Mr. Latimer, speculation serves little purpose. What matters at present is motive. And it appears, Mr. Carstairs, that Mrs. Carstairs held information which could have deprived you of a very considerable sum of money." Gerald swallowed. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost pleading. She would never have gone through with it. Venetia enjoyed drama. She thrived on having people in suspense. She liked power, but she wasn't vindictive. Dorothy made a peculiar sound. Half laugh, half choke. Not vindictive? She kept that wretched letter from Cheltenham for 3 days. 3 days, knowing it could clear my name, restore everything I'd lost. She let me live under suspicion in this house, even while she knew I'd been innocent all along. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. It was the first truly spontaneous remark Dorothy had made. Emotion, when it broke through calculation, often revealed more than any number of deliberate statements. "You resented her for that," Miss Marple said gently. "It would be quite human if you did." Dorothy's eyes flashed. "I was grateful for the position she gave me. I owed her everything." "One may both owe and resent," Miss Marple observed. "I have frequently seen the two go hand in hand. Think of grown children and aging parents, or ladies' companions entirely dependent on temperamental employers. Affection is not always unmixed with bitterness." Inspector Craddock intervened. "What I see is that both you, Miss Crane, and you, Mr. Carstairs, had reason to be deeply concerned about Mrs. Carstairs' investigations. One stood to lose reputation, the other estate. Both were present in the house at the relevant time. Both have given accounts now contradicted by independent witnesses." His gaze shifted between them. "Until further notice, you must each consider yourselves under suspicion." A faint rustle passed through the room. Skirts, displaced cushions, a soft intake of breath. Suspicion spoken aloud altered everything. It hardened vague unease into something more defined and dangerous. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with deliberate calm, though her mind was working rather faster than her fingers. Two principal suspects, both with credible motives and opportunities. Too credible, perhaps. Life, in her long experience, rarely arranged itself in such neat and symmetrical patterns, save when someone had taken great pains to make it appear so. And always, in the background of her thoughts, lingered the image of the house with its 2 identical doors. One green, one black. 2 ways in, 2 ways out. 2 stories told about movements through them. Somewhere amid that mirrored symmetry, she felt, lay the first real crack in the fade. The gathering gradually dispersed under Inspector Craddock's direction, guests escorted out in subdued clusters, their earlier excitement soured into unease. Statements were taken formally now, rather than amid teacups and flower arrangements. By early evening, only the immediate principals, the servants and Miss Marple, remained at Ashwood Manor. The atmosphere of the house had altered perceptibly. What had been a handsome, well-kept home now felt like a stage after the final curtain. Lights dimmed, illusions dispelled, the scenery suddenly sinister in its stillness. Inspector Craddock, to his credit, did not dismiss Miss Marple with the others. He had learned on previous occasions that her quiet observations had an inconvenient tendency to prove correct. "If you would care to accompany me, Miss Marple," he suggested with formal politeness, "I'd value your perspective as we walk through the house. Sometimes an untrained eye notices what professionals overlook. An old woman's eye," Inspector Miss Marple corrected gently, "can be particularly sharp when it comes to patterns of behavior." They began at the green door. The constable on duty stood aside as Craddock opened it, revealing the neat vestibule beyond. A faint smear of something dark was visible on the inner handle, a detail Miss Marple noted, though she said nothing. "The scream was heard from this side," Craddock remarked, "and yet both Gerald and Dorothy insist on linking themselves to the black door instead. People are sometimes curiously particular about their entrances and exits," Miss Marple observed. I knew a woman once who would rather climb over a back fence than be seen leaving through the front door in tears. They moved along the corridor to the library. The body had been removed, but the dark stain on the carpet remained, a grim punctuation mark beside the overturned chair. The bronze bookend lay on the desk now, tagged and ready for removal. Miss Marple looked not at the obvious, but at the periphery, the neat row of books, the faint indentation on the writing table where a heavy object had recently lain, the slight misalignment of the window curtains. She crossed to the inner door that connected the library with the opposite corridor, the one leading toward the black entrance. "How interesting," she murmured, fingering the handle, "that one may enter this room from either direction. The house rather reflects its mistress's circumstances, does it not? Balance between two worlds, past and present, legitimate heir and less legitimate." Craddock glanced sharply at her. "You believe the physical layout played a part?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied, "that whoever arranged matters today counted upon people thinking in straight lines, whereas the house itself offers quite a number of shortcuts." Before Craddock could respond, the sound of raised voices echoed faintly from the far end of the corridor. One was Gerald's, edged with panic. The other, higher and shriller, belonged unmistakably to Dorothy Crane. They found the pair in Mrs. Carstairs' bedroom. The handsome room had been thrown into disarray, drawers half open, the wardrobe gaping, the writing table's contents scattered. Dorothy stood rigid beside the bed, a letter clutched in her hand. Gerald, disheveled and wild-eyed, faced her as if she held a loaded pistol. "I told you," Dorothy was saying through clenched teeth, "I will not burn this. You may be willing to go down alone, but you won't drag me with you." Inspector Craddock stepped between them. "What's the meaning of this?" No one was to enter this room without police supervision. Dorothy held out the letter with trembling fingers. "It wasn't me searching, Inspector. I found Gerald rifling through Mrs. Carstairs' things. And this was hidden in the false bottom of her jewelry box." Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet satisfaction. Wealthy women, in her experience, frequently mistrusted banks, locks, and even relatives. False bottoms were as natural to them as secret pockets to small boys. Craddock took the letter and scanned it swiftly, his expression tightening. "This," he said slowly, "is from a firm of private investigators in London. Dated yesterday. It states that Mrs. Carstairs had obtained proof that the original will leaving everything to Gerald was forged, and that she was preparing to consult her solicitor about contesting it today. Gerald sagged against the wardrobe, the last vestiges of defiance draining from him. Yet even as the case against him strengthened, Miss Marple's attention drifted, not to his despair, but to Dorothy's reaction. For a brief moment, as the inspector read the letter aloud, an expression crossed her face that was not relief, nor vindication, but something far more dangerous. Triumph. Inspector Craddock regarded Miss Marple with a mixture of respect and faint exasperation. "Another crime, Miss Marple?" "With respect, it's difficult to imagine what could be more serious than murder." "Oh, murder is very serious indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "But it is rarely the beginning of a story, Inspector. More often, it is the final chapter of a much longer one. Mrs. Carstairs, for instance, appears to have been writing several such chapters herself, about wills, inheritances, stolen jewelry, and reputations." She moved toward the window that looked over the front drive. From here, both doors were clearly visible, like twin eyes regarding the village beyond. "A house with two doors," she mused, "suggests division, separation. But it can also suggest duplication, two ways of entering, two ways of exiting, perhaps even two versions of the same event." Craddock frowned. You're suggesting someone has constructed a kind of double story? Two parallel accounts of what happened today? Precisely, Miss Marple said. We have one story that everyone is meant to see. The quarrel in the garden, the stepson in financial peril, the disgraced companion. Then we have another, subtler story about keys that go missing, letters that are hidden, and movements through the house that do not quite align with the sound of a scream. Dorothy, who had been silent for several minutes, suddenly spoke in a strained voice. You keep saying another crime, Miss Marple. What do you think has been done? Besides, her voice faltered over the word. Besides killing Mrs. Carstairs? Miss Marple turned toward her with a gentle expression that did nothing to soften the sharpness of her gaze. My dear, when I was a girl, we had a maid in our village who was dismissed for pouring the mistress's best scent down the drain. At least, that was the story told. In reality, she had noticed someone had substituted water for the perfume and foolishly tried to conceal the deception. She did not understand that once something expensive has been replaced with something worthless, the true crime has already occurred. Everything afterward is merely rearrangement. Gerald gave a short, mirthless laugh. And which of us has poured the perfume away, Miss Marple? That, she replied, remains to be seen. At that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor. The young constable reappeared, breathless and visibly shaken. Inspector, sir, we've found something else. In the small study off the east corridor. The door was locked, but the key was on the top of the door frame. Craddock's attention sharpened. What have you found, Constable? The young man swallowed. A safe, sir. Open. And empty, except for some torn papers in the grate. They followed him to the narrow study, a cramped room lined with ledgers and battered reference books. Against one wall stood a solid iron safe, its door flung wide like a gaping mouth. Inside, only dust and the faint outline where packages had rested. In the small fireplace, grey ash mingled with half-burned fragments of parchment. Inspector Craddock crouched beside the grate, lifting a charred scrap with his pencil. Bank certificates, he muttered. Signatures partly legible. Government bonds, perhaps. Significant sums. Miss Marple stood very still. So, she said softly, the perfume has indeed been poured away. Mrs. Carstairs' most valuable securities, I should imagine. Stolen, then destroyed, or at least the evidence of their transfer destroyed. Gerald's protest was immediate. But Venetia kept her investments with the bank in Basingstoke. She always said this safe was merely for odds and ends. Dorothy's eyes had widened in horror. She began moving them here last month, she whispered. She told me herself, said she trusted bank clerks even less than relations. I begged her not to. Oh God. Miss Marple noted this little confession with the utmost care. Dorothy Crane had known where the true wealth lay, and had known it recently. That knowledge, in a house already divided by suspicion, was in itself a form of dangerous currency. What we must determine now, Miss Marple said quietly, is not merely who killed Mrs. Carstairs, but who profited by making it appear that she died before discovering what had been done to her fortune. The discovery of the empty safe hung over them like a new, darker cloud, and for the first time, the murder in the library no longer felt like the central event of the afternoon, but rather the violent consequence of something colder and more deliberate. They did not have to wait long. The constable returned from the grounds, his boots leaving faint streaks of damp earth on the polished parquet as he entered the library. His face bore the look of a man who had stumbled upon something quite beyond his usual village disturbances. "Inspector Craddock, sir," he said, holding out a bundle wrapped in sacking. We found this behind a loose brick in the ice house wall, just as Mr. Carstairs suggested. There were others too. Craddock unwrapped the bundle on the cleared expanse of Mrs. Carstairs' desk. Neatly bound sheaves of documents emerged, government bonds, certificates with imposing seals, a list of foreign shares in Mrs. Carstairs' hand. Mixed among them were several small velvet-lined cases. He opened one to reveal a cascade of diamonds that caught the fading light with cold brilliance. Her missing securities, Craddock said grimly. And her jewels. Mrs. Whitaker, are these items familiar to you? The Daily woman stepped forward, wiping her hands nervously on her apron before peering into one of the cases. That's the Carstairs tiara, sir. Only worn for very special occasions. Mrs. Venetia used to check on it regular, just to see it was there. Gerald stared in disbelief. But why move them from the safe if she feared theft? Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap as she regarded Dorothy Crane with mild, sorrowful interest. Because, my dear Gerald, she no longer trusted the safety of the house itself. When keys go missing, one must assume any lock may be opened. The ice house, being so seldom visited, would have seemed a temporary hiding place until she could decide whom she could still trust. Dorothy's lips moved soundlessly before she managed a hoarse whisper. I didn't put them there. I didn't. I never. But you knew of their existence, Miss Marple said gently. You helped carry the document cases from the bank. You knew the value of what Ashwood contained, down to the last share certificate. And you knew, too, that any whiff of fresh scandal would destroy your chances of respectable employment forever. Dorothy's hands clutched at the arms of her chair. I have been running from whispered accusations for years, Miss Marple. Always the outsider. Always the convenient suspect when some trinket went astray. Do you imagine I would be so foolish as to confirm their worst suspicions now? Not foolish, Miss Marple corrected softly. Desperate. There is a world of difference. Inspector Craddock had moved to the window, staring out toward the dark line of trees that concealed the ice house. When he turned back, his features had hardened into official lines. Miss Crane, you had motive, knowledge, and opportunity. You possessed the household keys and unrestricted access to Mrs. Carstairs' papers. You changed your dress and shoes after discovering the body, and your account of which door you used conflicts with both physical evidence and Mrs. Whitaker's testimony. Dorothy's composure suddenly crumbled. I changed because there was blood on my hem, she burst out, then clapped a hand to her mouth as though she could drag the words back. The room seemed to contract around her. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Blood, my dear. But you told us you never approached the body, merely glanced into the room. Dorothy shot to her feet, trembling. You don't understand. None of you understand. She broke off, staring wildly at the two doors visible from the library threshold, as though calculating escape. Then something else flickered in her face. Not calculation, but the dark resignation of someone who sees every exit closing at once. Miss Marple watched her with grave sympathy. Inspector, she said quietly, I think the time has come to adjust our approach. Miss Crane will not respond to direct accusation. She has spent too many years fending it off. If you will allow me a little latitude, I believe there is one more test we might employ. A very small one, but such trifles can be most revealing. Craddock hesitated, then nodded curtly. Very well, Miss Marple. But we must have something more than guesses soon. At present, the evidence points overwhelmingly in one direction, though even I must admit there are entity corners. Miss Marple's gentle smile returned, faint but unmistakable. Oh, I don't propose to rely on guesses, Inspector, only on human nature. If we arrange things just so, I fancy the guilty party will be quite unable to help themselves. Her gaze moved from the green door to the black, lingering for a moment as though counting the very boards between them. After all, she added softly, the whole matter began with doors. It seems only fitting that it should end with one, or perhaps with two. Dorothy shivered, as if someone had walked over her grave. Miss Marple allowed the murmurs to swell and ebb before speaking again. When she did, her voice was as mild as ever. "There is one person," she said, "whose evidence has been curiously pivotal at every stage, yet who has no obvious stake in the matter. Someone whose statements have quietly directed suspicion first toward Mr. Carstairs, then toward Miss Crane. Mrs. Whittaker, who had been edging toward the door as if her work might be needed elsewhere, froze mid-step. Inspector Craddock frowned. "You can't mean Mrs. Whittaker, Miss Marple. She's been extremely helpful." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed serenely. "Almost too helpful. She alone saw Mr. Gerald going through the green door with something concealed. She alone saw Miss Crane allegedly turning toward the library instead of the linen cupboard. She remembered the missing keys at just the right moment. And now, we find the safe emptied, and the securities hidden in a place known chiefly to those long familiar with the estate. The ice house." Mrs. Whittaker's ruddy face stiffened. "I've worked honest in this house for 15 years, miss. Mrs. Carstairs trusted me." "I dare say she did," Miss Marple replied. "Until she realized someone in the household had stolen not trinkets, but the very heart of her fortune. A daily woman has many opportunities. You know, dusting the writing desk, polishing the safe, handling keys." Craddock looked startled. But the vantage from the kitchen garden, she said she saw both front doors clearly. Miss Marple folded her knitting with neat precision. "That, Inspector, is what first troubled me. I took the liberty, while you were occupied in the study, of strolling to the kitchen garden. At this time of year, the runner beans along the trellis quite obscure the view of the green door from that position. One can see the black door clearly, certainly, but not the green." All eyes swung toward Mrs. Whittaker. A dull, mottled red had crept up her neck. "You could not have seen Mr. Gerald go through the green door," Miss Marple continued gently. "Yet you stated it with great certainty. Just as you were so sure Miss Crane turned toward the library, though from the scullery end of the corridor one cannot see that junction at all. Unless," her voice softened, "you were actually much nearer at the time." "I was hanging linens in the back passage," Mrs. Whittaker burst out. "I often do of a Thursday. You'd no cause to doubt me." "Of a Thursday, very likely," Miss Marple said. "But today is Wednesday." The simple statement landed with more force than any accusation. Mrs. Whittaker stared at her, mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "You see," Miss Marple went on, addressing the room at large, "Mrs. Whittaker's memory is quite good. Too good, in fact. She was not confused. She was constructing a story. She knew perfectly well which door each person used, for she was inside the house, moving between corridors, watching. It was she who took the writing case from Mrs. Carstairs' bedroom, she who located the safe key when the household set went missing, and she who, finding the securities, realized how very easy it would be to improve her own circumstances." Inspector Craddock's face had hardened. "Are you suggesting she emptied the safe, killed Mrs. Carstairs, and then planted evidence to implicate the others?" "Not all at once," Miss Marple said quietly. "That sort of thing grows. One takes a small risk at first, borrowing a bond, perhaps, intending to replace it. Then fortune turns unfriendly. A son in trouble, perhaps? A grandson with debts? Such things weigh heavily on a woman of modest means." Mrs. Whittaker's shoulders sagged as if a great weight had been placed upon them. "Mrs. Carstairs," Miss Marple continued gently, "was no fool. Yesterday, when she sat weeping in the library, I suspect she had just confirmed that her safe had been tampered with. She would, quite naturally, speak first to the person who had daily access, the woman she trusted with her household routines. Their conversation would not have been pleasant. Dorothy made a small, involuntary sound. Gerald simply stared. "You followed her to the library just before 2:30, Miss Marple said. "You took the bookend from the shelf while her back was turned. You struck once, only once. A woman does not need multiple blows when her fear has reached its height." Mrs. Whittaker's voice emerged at last, hoarse and strangled. "She said she'd send for the police. Said I'd go to prison, like common trash. I worked myself near to death for this house." And afterward, Miss Marple went on. "Not unkindly. You realized the garden party would provide excellent cover. You hid the stolen papers in the ice house, confident no one would think to look there. When you heard about Miss Crane's past, you saw how neatly suspicion could be directed. A few well-chosen observations about doors and movements, a pair of monogrammed gloves left where they would be found. They were old," Mrs. Whittaker muttered dully. "He never missed them." Inspector Craddock stepped forward. "Mrs. Whittaker, I must ask you to come with me." She looked around the library once, her gaze lingering on the empty space where the tiara had gleamed moments before. "I never meant for it to go so far," she whispered. "I only wanted enough so my Maisie needn't scrub floors all her life." Miss Marple watched as the constable led the woman away, her knitting untouched in her lap. The house with 2 doors had yielded its final secret at last. Not a grand conspiracy of inheritance and romance alone, but the far more commonplace tragedy of envy, fear, and a moment's desperate violence. The removal of Mrs. Whittaker seemed to release a pressure valve in the room. People shifted, exhaled, and began to speak in the low, uncertain tones of those trying to reorient themselves after a storm. The villain had been named, yet the air felt far from clear. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "Mrs. Whittaker will be charged with murder, along with long-standing fraud," he said. "Her confession will need to be formally taken, of course, but the essential outline is clear." Dorothy Crane sat very still in her chair, her eyes fixed on the recovered satchel and tiara, as though they held her fate in their jeweled facets. Gerald remained by the window, staring out at the lawn, where bunting still fluttered incongruously in the evening breeze. "Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly, "there remains the matter of the stolen securities and jewelry. Mrs. Whittaker may have been defrauding the household for years, but this more recent theft was of a different order altogether." Craddock glanced from Dorothy to Gerald. "Quite so. Miss Crane, Mr. Carstairs, would you care to explain how these items came to be hidden in the ice house?" Dorothy swallowed, her hands twisting together. "It was my idea," she admitted at last, voice barely above a whisper. "When Venetia began locking everything in the safe, Gerald panicked. His investments had gone badly. He'd borrowed heavily against his expected inheritance. If she altered her will, she faltered. Gerald took over, his voice rough. I thought I had time, months at least, to set things right. Then Venetia told me she'd been in touch with the solicitor about revising everything. I suggested we might, as a temporary measure, move some of the securities, just until I could recoup my losses. Temporary theft is still theft, Inspector Craddock observed dryly. Dorothy nodded miserably. I convinced myself we were only safeguarding them from her sudden whims. I took the keys a fortnight ago when Mrs. Whittaker left them on the scullery shelf. We moved the papers and jewels together and hid them in the ice house. We meant to put everything back once Gerald's affairs improved, before she ever knew. Miss Marple's knitting resumed its gentle clicking. Human beings, she remarked, are very adept at finding comforting words for uncomfortable actions. One rarely calls it stealing in one's own mind. Dorothy's shoulders shook. When Venetia started weeping yesterday, I knew she'd discovered something. I spent the night terrified she'd accuse me publicly at the Fefty. When she sent word this morning that she wished to see me privately this afternoon, I thought... She broke off, pressing a handkerchief to her face. You thought the prison door was opening, Miss Marple finished quietly, just as Mrs. Whittaker feared. 2 women, each clinging to precarious security, each guilty of theft to different degrees. But only one took the final step into violence. Inspector Craddock closed the satchel again. The securities and jewelry will be returned to Mrs. Carstairs' estate. As for you, Miss Crane, Mr. Carstairs, there will be charges to consider. Theft, tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice. Gerald looked at Miss Marple, a kind of desperate curiosity in his eyes. Did you ever think I had killed her, Miss Marple? Oh, yes, she answered, with disarming honesty. It would have been most natural if you had, but human nature, real human nature, is rarely tidy. You blustered too much, Mr. Carstairs, yet you never quite rang true as a man who had struck in cold blood. Fear and weakness, certainly, not brutality. Dorothy looked up, red-eyed. And me? You, Miss Marple said gently, showed all the signs of someone who had done a wrong thing for what she believed were right reasons, and was trying very hard not to look at it too closely. People who kill generally look straight at what they have done, even when they lie about it. There is a hardness that was blessedly absent in you. Outside, the last of the 50 decorations fluttered in the dimming light. It would all be cleared away by morning, Miss Marple knew. Trestle tables folded, bunting taken down. Cake crumbs swept up as though nothing unusual had occurred. But the village would not soon forget that on a perfect summer afternoon, beneath the neat lawns and clipped hedges of Ashwood Manor, so many varieties of quiet desperation had come so suddenly to light. The following morning, little Brackenhurst awoke to a pale, washed light after a night of uncharacteristic restlessness. The scandal at Ashwood Manor had spread through the village with the speed and subtlety of a gale, yet for once the gossip carried more truth than fancy. Mrs. Whittaker had been charged. Gerald Carstairs and Dorothy Crane remained at Ashwood under police instruction, subdued and oddly chastened. The Women's Institute, with admirable practicality, had already begun planning how best to redistribute the leftover sandwiches. Miss Marple sat by the front window of Mrs. Bantry's house, a cup of tea at her elbow and her knitting once more in her lap. The garden, with its late roses and slightly bedraggled Fefty decorations, looked almost innocent again. Mrs. Bantry, still very much absorbed in the business, sat opposite her with a newspaper folded to the relevant column. "They've already sent a man from the county paper," she announced, calling it the Ashwood Manor Mystery. They make it sound quite glamorous, rather leaves out the sordid parts. "My dear," Miss Marple replied mildly, "real wickedness is nearly always sordid. It's novels and newspapers that feel obliged to make it entertaining." Inspector Craddock was shown in shortly thereafter, looking tired but more at ease than he had the previous day. He accepted a cup of tea with gratitude and regarded Miss Marple with genuine respect. "I've just come from Ashwood," he said. "Whittaker has signed a full confession. She admits to siphoning off household funds for years, then panicking when she realized Mrs. Carstairs had finally noticed. She waited for the garden party, followed her into the library and... Well, you know the rest." Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving serenely. "And Mr. Gerald and Miss Crane?" "They'll stand trial for theft and obstruction," Craddock replied. "But the Crown may be lenient. Their solicitor is already arguing that discovering the body precipitated their panic. There's sympathy for them, oddly enough. People are often indulgent toward romantic folly, Miss Marple observed, particularly when there is a murderess conveniently available to bear the brunt of moral indignation. Craddock's mouth quirked slightly. You were right about everything that mattered, you know. The doors, the timings, the false helpfulness. I was too ready to believe the obvious pattern. It's very natural, Miss Marple said kindly. Human beings like neat arrangements. They so rarely occur in real life that when evidence appears to fall tidily into place, one ought to be especially wary. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. I still can't quite see how you knew it was Mrs. Whittaker rather than Dorothy or poor Gerald. Beyond the beans and the door, I mean. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Dorothy is vain, Dolly. Not extravagantly, but enough. She changed her dress after discovering the body, quite foolish, but consistent with someone anxious about appearances. Mrs. Whittaker, on the other hand, is entirely practical. When she spoke of Mrs. Carstairs yesterday, she referred to her as that woman, rather than the mistress, even before she was truly under suspicion. Long resentment, you see. And then there was the way she spoke of the tiara. The tiara? Craddock repeated. She called it the Carstairs family tiara, Miss Marple said. Not Mrs. Venetia's tiara. That's the sort of proprietary phrasing people use when they feel they've some claim to the household's treasures. 15 years of small thefts had, in her mind, blurred the line between hers and theirs. Craddock regarded her with frank admiration. You see such an extraordinary amount, Miss Marple. She shook her head gently. One sees very little that is new, Inspector. Human nature is much the same everywhere, whether in a grand house with 2 doors or in a little cottage with 1. People tell you who they are all the time, in the way they speak, in what they notice, in what they choose to conceal. One simply has to listen. Outside, a small knot of villagers passed, talking in hushed, excited tones as they glanced toward Ashwood's distant chimneys. Life in Little Brackenhurst was already knitting itself back together, though a faint, indelible crease of unease remained. Miss Marple finished her tea and folded her knitting with gentle precision. Somewhere, she reflected, another village, another house, another quiet resentment would be slowly ripening into danger. For the moment, however, the roses needed deadheading. The vicar's wife was organizing a jumble sale, and the world, so far as it ever did, looked pleasantly ordinary again. She rose, her slight figure neat and composed. Dolly, my dear, she said, if you can spare me a few cuttings from that yellow rose by the gate, I think it would do very well in my front border. One must attend to small things, you know. The large ones have such a tiresome way of attending to themselves. And with that, Miss Marple stepped out into the mild English morning, a gentle old lady among the roses, with murder, as ever, quietly filed away beside her knitting patterns, in the orderly cupboards of her remarkable mind.